Good morning. Welcome to our Values podcast series. My name is Jarosław Jańczak from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland.
And my name is Beata Przybylska-Maszner. I'm the head of the European Integration Research Department at the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, one of the oldest and most beautiful city in Poland.
This podcast is a part of the Values project, the Jean Monnet Policy Network, titled ValEUs, Research and Education Network on Contestation to EU Foreign Policy. It is founded from the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission for a 3-year period starting from January 2024. This ambitious initiative involving 20 partner institutions from 17 countries across 5 continents focuses on the foreign policy of the European Union and the challenges posed to its values. We investigate them in issues such as migration, asylum policy, and the enlargement process that are highlighted as potential areas of systematic deviation from established normative standards. Our project is founded by the European Union. Views and opinions as expressed are, however, those of the authors only, and not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the agency can be held responsible for them. Okay, let's start with presenting our academic profiles. Beata, could you please present yourself?
I'm a political scientist and Europeanist. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the European Integration Yearbook. For 18 years, together with the editorial team, we create subsequent editions of one of the most well-known scientific journals devoted to European issues in Poland. I also cooperate with other members of Team Europe Direct Poland. This is a network of experts in European studies created by the European Commission representation in Poland. My academic interests focus around the themes of institutionalization process of the European Union's common foreign and security policy, in particular its influence on EU relations with African states. My research also concentrates on reforms of EU institutional system and institutional framework of common security and defense policy. I was the coordinator of 2 research projects on crisis management in the EU, as well as military operations in Africa and civilian missions of the European Union in the years 2004-2020. Since 2016, I was a coordinator of project, the European Council in the process of shaping its informal and informal powers within the scope of EU external actions. It was a grant obtained by the National Center for Science in Poland. I was also a member of Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. The title of the project was EU External Actions in the Contested Global Order in Coherence, Discontinuity and Resilience. The key objective of the project was to enhance understanding of the European Union's role in international politics by equipping a wide audience of students and scholars representing numerous domestic and foreign academic centers with knowledge related to external actions and external involvement of the European Union. I participated in Jean Monnet chair regarding theoretical concepts of differentiated integration, Jean Monnet module. The title of the model was the double reunification through the EU education policies. And I was also a member of 2 Jean Monnet networks on EU foreign policy, Nortia and RENPET. So, Jarek, what about you?
But thank you very much for your presentation. Before I present myself, I guess we can invite all our listeners, especially scholars, to publish in the journal you mentioned, so the Yearbook of European Integration. A broad spectrum of scholars from different universities have been publishing in your journal, and I believe that everyone who would be interested would be warmly welcomed. Okay, but let me present myself then. I am a political scientist, Europeanist, researcher of borders. I have been working as an associate professor at the Department of International Relations at the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism of the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland. And my academic interests focus around the themes of borders and border areas within the context of European integration processes. In particular, they cover the phenomena of debordering and rebordering, cross-border governance, European integration from the micro-scale perspective, cross-border cooperation in Europe, as well as the neighborhood policy and external relations of the EU. Beata has just presented a long list of projects she has been participating in, or even more commonly leading. And in most of them, we have been collaborating. So we have been doing many things together in terms of academic activities. Let me maybe stress two other projects that I have been recently involved in. So the first that I believe is somehow relevant from the perspective of what we are doing here in ValEUs was the K2 Higher Education Strategic Partnerships for Higher Education project called Developing a New Curriculum in Global Migration, Diaspora and Border Studies in East Central Europe, implemented by a consortium of several European universities between 2020 and 2023. And let me mention one more belonging to international capacity building of the Erasmus Plus project, Rethinking Regional Studies, the Baltic Black Sea connection, in 2017-2020, a project implemented by a consortium of 4 Ukrainian and 4 EU universities. Okay, having this background presented, let us focus today on what we would like to briefly discuss, namely the southern and eastern dimensions of the EU, with a special focus on interests, values, and what is the most important, contestations. Beata, how do you understand those concepts and terms? How you have been working with those categories? What sort of typologies do you use?
I'm really pleased to present my projects. Most of them fall within the scope of EU external actions. So far, my main research interests focus on transformation of EU foreign and security policy. Over the last 2 years, I have been researching the issue of European Union as a promoter of the concept of multilateralism. Multilateralism underpins the identity of the European Union and its international commitment. The Global Strategy 2016 emphasized the importance of a global order based on multilateralism, which is founded on the United Nations principles. Promoting this approach has become one of the EU's strategic goals. To implement multilateralism, the EU has created a whole toolbox of political, diplomatic, and financial instruments aimed at promoting peace and security in the world, defending human rights and the principles of international law, and promoting multilateral solutions to global problems. However, even though multilateral achievements in building the international order have been commonly appreciated, this approach has recently been heavily criticized. Some of the reasons for the emergence of new actors on the global stage, the expansive policies of Russia, turn points in the United States foreign policy, the weakening of multilateral institutions, the widening gap between civil society and international institutions, and an internal lack of faith in the European dream of effective cooperation. I wanted in my research to identify factors that influence on proactive role of the EU in defending the multilateral approach. In fact, this has been the guiding principle of the EU's external relations since its inception. In recent years, the EU has developed its own governance mechanism for its external relations based on effective multilateralism. But the question I want to pose, how was the approach developed and how should it be understood? What drives the EU's commitment to protect this approach? I tried to answer the above questions by explaining the scope of the EU's commitment to effective or efficient multilateralism and to the promotion of global governance architectures reforms. What can I add? That for me it was very important to focus on two major themes, EU contestation and EU relevance. So if we take in consideration EU contestation, we should answer many questions. How do recent dynamics in and between member states affect EU foreign policy identity? Do these dynamics lead to a more goal-orientated and interest-driven EU foreign policy or a stronger value-dominated European foreign policy? If you take in consideration EU relevance, so we should answer even more questions. How can the EU be a relevant power in the era characterized by a retreat from multilateralism and power politics? What does EU power mean in the respect and how does it help to design and implement a coherent and effective EU foreign policy? So there are so many problems we should solve, but I would like to stress that the most important, we should point out that the multipolar system of contemporary international relations, multilateralism has become an expression on how to use force and where it leads. In this context, it's worth referring to multipolarity. Multipolarity refers to the way power is distributed in the world and to the emergence of various global actors who are carving the superpower status of the United States. So research on multilateralism demonstrates how to deal with this reality. Although the terms alternate, each has a different functional application when describing the realities of international relations. At the end, I would like to add that multilateralism is and will remain a guiding principle of EU as the most effective way to govern global relations. The EU cannot be the only multilateralist. Other parties have to be convinced to this idea, and we can see that it's not so easy to have such a vision in the modern world. To be effective, multilateralism must bring results on the one hand and serve the interest to protect the values of both the EU and other actors on the other. However, it's not certain whether the formula of working out for example, unanimous decisions will allow the EU to adopt stricter positions against, among others, violations of international law by Russia or by China. EU needs hard power and common defense solutions. Points of reference are clearly changing. The most important values to be protected are security and stability, the achievement of which will impact the achievement of other related goals. In the next decade, it may turn out that the survival of the EU will rely on the military cooperation developed under the EU strategic autonomy within a multilateral framework. So, Jarek, and what about your research?
Yeah, Beata, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So basically, I've been working with very similar problems. However, as you know, I'm trying to analyze it from a little bit different perspective. So when thinking about multilateralism and contestation and foreign policy of the European Union, my key starting point is basically the European Union itself, and how is it related to the external environment. So me personally, instead of looking for multipolarity, is more an approach where I'm concentrating on the EU and then only trying to deconstruct how the European Union sees itself. So basically, categories of foreign policy for me is always related to domestic policy. So basically, as a border scholar, I see always this distinction between inside and outside. And political, social, economic processes happening on both sides of the border. And then for me, a border becomes the key crucial category in understanding how the external or foreign policy is executed. So borders from the EU perspective understood as who is us and who is not us. So who are the others. So from this perspective, the way how the EU external borders are understood has very important consequences for how the European Union might be interpreted, how the European Union interprets itself, but also how it can be interpreted from outside. And here we, I believe, have a huge space for also considering values in foreign policy and contestation of those values. So thinking more conceptually, I've been working on geopolitical models of the European Union, especially as the discussion has been initiated by authors like Christopher Browning, Bertillon Niemi, or William Walters. So basically, following their thoughts, I see at least three ways how the European Union might be interpreted from the point of view of edges and consequently relations to the neighboring spaces. So first of all, the European Union can be seen as a semi-Westphalian organism. So then we have clearly defined territory, we have external borders. Well, membership of the European Union is the key indicator of what the European Union is. So you are either a member or not a member. At all. You're either in or you are totally outside. If you're a member, you are a part of the grouping. There are decision-making bodies, procedures, and so on that more or less equally affect everything what is inside. The second of the models that have been developed is an imperial model. So here we get into the vision of the European Union instead of European Union. So semi-concentric circles where the European project is not about being in or being out, but about being more in or more out. So you might be a member participating additionally in Eurozone, Schengen zone, and so on and so on. But you might be also a member just without those two elements, or you might be just a candidate, you might be associated, you might be a partner, and so on. So at the end of the day, we have a set of semi-concentric circles, and the European project is much more than only being in or being out. It's a set of interrelated arrangements between the center and different types of peripheries. There is finally the third interpretation of the European Union following the geopolitical models, namely so-called neo-medieval models. So at the end of the day, we have just different states. They have their own centers. They interact with each other. And well, the EU is just a sum of those national bubbles that get into interactions. And when following these logics, we might observe really interesting consequences for a normative order, norms and values, and the way how they are contested. Because, well, assuming the EU is a semi-Westphalian entity, I believe we can clearly talk about norms and values. I mean, European norms and values that shall be more or less the same or similarly accepted within the entire inside. So basically within the entire community. So we could assume that there are norms and values, they are similar, they are shared, and so on. And they are at the same time different than the norms and values that characterize the others. So all those that are outside the EU, that are not the members. But in case we assume the EU is following more the imperial model, so those semi-concentric circles, we would definitely see that norms and values are very diversified. And the closer you are to the EU center, the more coherent they are. And the farther away from the center you move, they are less and less coherent with those from the center. So we assume then that there is a huge diversity of norms and values, of the European norms and values. However, the distance to the center, political distance, determines how closely one is attached to the European norms and values. So in this model, we could clearly assume that that there are European peripheries, and that norms and values at the European peripheries, they are simply different from what is dominant in the center. And then if we follow the third of the model, so the neo-medieval, then from the normative point of view, we have totally different picture. We would assume, I'm sorry, that there is not clearly something like European norms and values. We have just national or local or regional norms and values. And there is plenty of them across Europe, and they just get into interaction with each other. And the common denominator is only what we label as European norms and values. So depending which model you apply, you have a totally different picture of what is a driving force when we think normatively. But was there a question? Have I?
Yes. So one more remark. I agree, because I think that it's very useful to say that EU can face to the challenges of the modern world, taking into account two conditions in light of the increasingly transactional nature of the global system. The EU should build and strengthen coalitions with partners, Southern and Eastern, who share a similar outlook on the matters of supreme importance. This does not mean, however, that the problem related to multilateralism applied in the practice of the EU's functioning and shaping its foreign policy priorities will disappear. But the credibility of the idea, as well as the position of the EU as its defender, will depend on whether the EU can face up to the internal crisis.
Yeah, thank you for this remark. It's indeed relevant to understand the dynamics behind the both foreign policy and the normative order. I believe, because the multilateral approach that you have been discussing and you have been working on assumes then, I believe, that we simply have, following a little bit this neo-medieval argument, also a wide variety of norms and values, and the global order, consequently, and the position of the European Union is just a matter of how we are able to discuss them and compromise on them.
Yes, but then, And
Yeah,
compliance with the principle of seeking multilateral solutions also applies to working out decisions when the interests of all member states, including those with less influence, need to be protected.
Yeah, I totally agree with this argument, where we jump into another dilemma we have been observing when working on external policy of the European Union. So the relations between normative level and interest level. But let me still have one more maybe follow-up, because yeah, the multilateral approach you have presented leads indeed to the situation where we have actually different centers with different normative orders, which might be a challenge of the EU. But on the other hand, I've been also observing that for at least the last 3, maybe even 4 decades, the European Union has been seeing quite often itself as a source of universal values, and is or has been painfully confronted with the fact that it is not widely recognized. And then I was also trying to reflect a little bit on, okay, so how the EU is constructing its flow of ideas and norms from the center to the peripheries, or more broadly, from Europe to other global centers and so on. And then again, I find really inspiring the works from already the 1980s of Kanerv and Palonen, and they were actually trying to describe, yeah, what is the dynamics behind the idea flow. And their argument was that usually we have some centers. Those centers might be imagined, of course, so somebody sees himself or herself as a center, as the European Union quite often sees itself as a normative center in the global context. And then the center is trying to export specific solutions, ideas, norms, and so on to what is considered periphery. So periphery is usually the others. But then Kanerva and Palonen, they claim that it quite often doesn't work, because specific norms and ideas, even if they are claimed to be universal, they are usually born under specific conditions, under specific circumstances. So something that works in one place, but is exported somewhere else, is not necessarily working there well, because it does not correspond with local conditions, legacies, experiences, and so on. So what they claim that when you export norms and values, without any deeper reflection, you quite often observe or see just an imitation of those norms and values. So they are exported, they are implemented, but they doesn't work in there. They have totally different meaning. And things like democracy in the liberal sense and so on, exported from the European centers to some peripheries, quite often does not work well there. So what to do to make them working? And Panerv and Kalonen claim, okay, you need to adjust them to the local conditions. You need to modify them. You need to make them working locally and so on. So how to do it? And they claim, yeah, there are at least two ways of doing that. So you can either shorten the ideas, the solutions, the norms, and so on, so get rid of some parts, or maybe develop and add local elements that will make them really working. But then when further, yeah, Beata, please.
I agree with you, but one more remark. The EU's democratic and regulatory strength. So we can consider the EU as a center of democratic and regulatory strength, but as an asset that has built a world of principle, while the EU's credibility as a peacekeeper and its security and defense structures can contribute to multilateral efforts to maintain, for example, preserve and build peace. The EU's strategic goal in terms of its foreign policy is to take advantage of its role and influence in a multilateral system to pursue its own interests and defend its values. Whether or not the above political goals of the EU are achieved depends primarily on how effective it is at playing the role of an international standardization body. The EU and its member states influence the multilateral system through an effectively used coordination mechanism, external representation capacities, and donor influence. However, engagement does not always lead to political success, and the results do not always live up to expectations. The most important challenge for the EU is educating member states to build their awareness of global problems and the role of the EU in the international arena with regard to issues such as human rights and environmental protection. This is of the utmost importance in combining disinformation and can determine whether the EU maintains unity or even survives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And what you have said, actually, from my perspective, brings automatically another question. Because thinking again, according to the multilateral principles, we could assume that it is not only the EU exporting norms and values, but also other centers or global poles trying to export their norms and values. The question is, to what extent the EU is also open not only for exporting norms and values, but also to importing norms and values and being open to other norms and values, creating this flow of norms and values, not one-dimensional, so from the European center to what is considered global peripheries and so on, but also from the other global centers to the European Union. And maybe the situation you have mentioned at the beginning of your speech today with contested global order and ongoing changes in the global order is just a situation where this two-dimensional flow has been imposed to some extent on the European Union, where suddenly the EU is forced to accept or at least play according to some of the norms and values that come from outside and that are not necessarily considered the best ones in the EU. We have been talking already for almost 45 minutes, which means that our podcast shall stop here. Beata, let me thank you for being here. Let me thank you for your ideas and sharing your research with us. I think that we shall also thank all the listeners for following our podcast, and I believe we shall encourage everyone also to visit the webpage of our project, so the ValEUs EU, and take advantage of also other materials, texts, videos, and so on that have been produced as a part of the ValEUs project. Beata, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jarek.